So we might get there, I think. The trouble with a couple challenges, I think, that in a constitutional convention, one, it takes about 3 elections to get there. One to call a convention, a second to choose the delegates, and a third to ratify the results. I'm in a bit more of a hurry to fix this problem. Another challenge is that even though we might ask the delegates to consider just these fiscal conflicts, there's nothing apparently in the Constitution to prevent them from putting the whole document up for grabs. That might not be a problem for anybody who's read the Colorado Constitution lately. There's a lot of provisions that probably don't belong there, but I'm not sure that that process would produce a result that the voters, who have the right to ratify it in the end, would accept. I'll just mention one shortcut that I've floated this summer, and we could talk about it today. It's a 2-step process, not 3. And it would first ask the voters for permission to take a temporary targeted timeout from the single subject rule. Just to be clear, the single subject rule is in our Constitution for a good reason. It's the rule that says ballot measures can't have more than one subject in them. That's a good idea. If that rule weren't in place, our ballot measures would be even more hopelessly complicated than they are now. They would look like the sort of Christmas trees that get ornamented in Congress with all sorts of unrelated provisions where you're passing a bill to provide relief to farmers and you accidentally nuke the whales. I mean, we don't do that in Colorado. For good reason, because we say everything's got to actually fit the same subject. The problem is, in this case, that rule prevents us from crafting comprehensive fiscal reform. It prevents us from having a conversation about the interaction among Tabor and Gallagher and Amendment 23 and Arvescow-Byrd at once. Even Tabor alone has more tentacles in different parts of the Constitution than you could lop off with one blade. I'm suggesting that we ought to put that package on the same table and craft a more sensible fiscal policy. We ought not remove the right of the voters to approve or reject tax increases. We should take that provision off the table. But we ought to, I think, at least put everything else up for discussion. If the voters gave us permission to take such a timeout, just for that purpose, and just for a single session or two, not for any purpose, not for anyone, not for any purpose, not forever, just long enough to craft a fiscal solution, here's what would happen. The legislature would go back to work. That's our job. In 2009, let's say, or 2010, depending on when you asked permission in the first place, we would try to reconcile the demands of Tabor and 23 and Gallagher and Arvescow-Byrd. If we succeeded, we would have a proposal, which also would require voter approval. This is important, in my view. We would not be asking the voters to buy a pig in a poke. We would refer any proposal back to the ballot. The voters could say, thanks for trying, not interested, no. But we can't even ask without the first vote that gives us permission to have this multi-subject conversation. That would be one approach that I think we could take before, or at least immediately following the expiration of Referendum C. I'll try to keep good to at least one promise today and stop talking and take your questions. But thank you for giving me a chance to share some time with you. Now that I've thoroughly depressed you all, do you have any questions at all? I want to say one other thing real quick. If you don't need to take notes, it's too late, obviously, to offer this advice, or maybe you didn't want to anyway, but I'll be happy to email this presentation around if you want. You can mark it up. And if you give me your email address, there's a couple clipboards that were going around earlier with sign up for that purpose. If you still have those clipboards, share them with a neighbor. There's one. Yes, Leslie, a plant.
What's the legislators going to do about the severance tax?
I should probably defer this question to Gail because she's been spending most of the summer on this interim committee. Do you want to talk about what you might have in store for the severance tax?
We a little bit later. I'll share some time with Randy. We'll talk about our process this summer that really is about many of the issues we've been talking about today. How we actually collect the funds we're entitled to, how we spend them in an appropriate, accountable way, and also how we evaluate and quantify the impacts that the industry is, both mining as well as oil and gas have created. So our process is not about raising the tax. Are we doing the best with what we have? And the shorthand is that once the information that we've been presenting, that we're collecting about half of New Mexico or Wyoming, is that it's going to be a choice of the voters to modify how we're collecting it and at what rate we're collecting it. So again, it's going back to the citizens to say how do they want to handle it. So that's where we are.
A law earlier this year that makes sure that oil and gas companies are at least paying what they owe by making their accounting practices more transparent. So we're collecting what we're due from the existing rates. I don't know what the legislature, what this committee will recommend or what the legislature will decide. I will try to make sure, and I know that you're a representative as well too, that the first dollar go towards mitigating the impact of this development on the communities that are affected by it, because I think that's an appropriate use for those severance tax dollars. Yeah, Rachel?
You talked about a larger package that may go to the voters at some point with fiscal reforms. Would you see enabling language to let local communities vote on real estate transfer taxes for their specific needs, whether they're open space or affordable housing or whatever, be part of that package?
Yes. Try to keep my answer short. I've talked actually a little bit to Colorado Counties and the Colorado Municipal League, and here's my guarantee. I think if we go to the ballot and ask permission to craft a comprehensive fiscal reform, one that in turn has to return to the ballot at some point, and that's part of this two-step tango, that the only provision that I think ought to be off the table is the ability of voters to say yes or no to tax increases. That provision has been in the Constitution for 15 years. It will be, and I think should be forever. But if you're talking about the ability of voters actually to exercise that right, then I think we should not stand in the way. Other questions? Easier questions? State capitals, something like that? How can that be? You're just hungry? Jack, the man from no name.
In terms of the real effort to develop housing, it's a question and a problem almost in every part of the state. And what I really care about is the able to have housing, homeless people and low income. Almost all the efforts I hear talk about workers' housing or workforce housing. I'm just curious if we're going to leave those folks still farther behind.
First, I want you to know Jack Reel, who used to lobby for the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, and a good friend, but with whom I've never discussed this question, helped me produce the very first bill I think I carried in the legislature, one that makes a property tax exemption available to public-private partnerships, housing developments that in turn make their property available to the very lowest income. I think, what did we pick, 33% of the area median income? Pretty hard to make the math work on a project that serves a population that low without some help from the state, and we provided some help, and I hope it's working. There has been, as you know, a lot of conversation at the Capitol about dedicating a source of revenue to affordable housing. 37 other states in America do that. They have housing trust funds. We have not succeeded in coming up with a financing mechanism that enjoys broad enough support to pass. And if it required a tax policy change, it would have to go to the ballot. But I think that makes sense. The struggle we've had, housing is one of those discretionary lines in the budget that get cut when times are tough. There is no constitutional requirement to provide affordable housing, so Colorado slashed support to a point, I think, where we must have ranked last in the nation because the line item, I think, was zero. Hard, unless we started charging people. I don't know how we could have fallen further. I don't know. I actually just had a conversation today with some advocates for housing who are looking at another source of revenue. I think Representative Gibbs, who represents perhaps some of you in Eagle and Summit and Lake County, is going to be working on that proposal. I'm not sure they're quite ready for prime time, but you might want to follow up with him. He's younger than me. Yes?
You had mentioned one strategy, reducing the utilization of emergency room services that aren't appropriate and focusing on preventive care. Can you detail that out some more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, announcement is obviously worth a pound to cure, and we've seen too many families end up in the emergency room. We had this conversation, let me just provide a little context. I served on the healthcare committee for about 3 years, and I watched our constituents come in and complain about rising premiums. They were small business owners, they were families, individuals in many cases with pre-existing conditions. They said, we can't afford double-digit increases every year. We're going broke. Employers said, we'd like to continue to provide insurance, but we're not required to, and we can't afford to. There was a crisis on our hands, so we hauled in a lot of folks from the insurance industry, and we said, well, how come you're charging so much more every year? The insurance companies said, it's not our fault. It's the hospitals. They're charging us more, we're just passing along the increases. So we brought in the hospital executives, and we said, how come you're jacking up rates too? And the hospital executives said, it's not our fault. It's the uninsured. There's almost 800,000 of them in Colorado now. They end up in our ERs. We can't eat all that uncompensated care. We've got to pass along the cost. Why don't you ask them? Eventually, we decided to put an end to this sort of circular firing squad and put all these folks in the same room. insurance company representatives, hospital execs, doctors, patients, nurses, consumer representatives, business experts. I suggested at one point we throw in a raccoon. And we gave them a year to come up with a comprehensive plan. That was the point of Senate Bill 208. That commission, which included about 24, now 27 of the smartest folks that we could find, asked for an extension because Massachusetts, which had the same task, had taken 4 years. We gave our team 1. Their report is due at the end of January. I think it will, among the proposals they're considering, which range from a Massachusetts-style combination of individual and employer mandates to a single-payer plan, there's a pretty broad spectrum of proposals under the recommendation list. I think what everybody agrees is that putting a priority on prevention just makes sense. And so we have made some progress in that field. We're helping more kids get access to the Children's Health Plan, as we know that kids who get served by that program are more likely to get the care and shots and treatment they need and less likely to use the ER. The president, frankly, has made that job a little tougher. I'm hopeful that Congress and he will be able to work out a compromise. So I think we could start with kids. There's no reason in Colorado, one of the richest states in America, that any child should have to go without health insurance. I think we can get there from here. And then I think we should talk about adults. There are some, I think, efforts underway, maybe in these communities too, around access to clinics on a non-emergency basis, networks of providers that are willing to see folks for regular care, maintenance care, instead of just emergency care. I'm not convinced, to be candid, that we have to spend a lot more money on health care. I just think we need to spend it more wisely, and that's where I hope the 208 Commission will steer us. You may have a chance to vote on that proposal too next year. Yes? Go ahead.
How much support is there among your colleagues for constitutional reform? And what are your next steps and what can people look at to do?
Thank you for that friendly question. The question was, how much support among my colleagues for this sort of approach, and what are the next steps, and what can you do to help? In that order? And we didn't have this conversation either in advance, right? Although I'll be compensating you afterwards. Here, I think there is likely to be broad support in the legislature for this approach because most folks, not just the folks who serve on the Joint Budget Committee and do the math for a living, but the folks who are trying to wrestle with the competing demands and priorities of their constituents recognize that this system is not sustainable. Mike May, the minority leader, fairly conservative Republican from Douglas County, has endorsed the approach that I suggested today. Other Republicans and Democrats, I think, are interested as well. Some have said we ought to figure out what the final package looks like before we go to the ballot and ask permission to craft it. That's tough. It might be more politically appealing, but the truth is I don't know what the solution to all these conflicting demands looks like. We are not even allowed to refer such a proposal to the ballot before we get permission in advance. So that's one challenge. The next step might be to actually sit down and try to hammer out a proposal and then go to the ballot and ask permission to refer it in a year or two. Trouble is, of course, you also buy the opposition a year or two to demonize it and demagogue it and do what they do best. It's remarkably liberating, I sometimes think, to be on the other side of these debates. I'd had a lot of battles with Doug Bruce and John Caldera, and if you just say whatever you want, you're not tethered to the truth. It's a remarkably freeing experience. So we need a coalition. We need a coalition of folks, and then that's where you come in. I mean, the truth is, if this proposal, let's say we passed the first step, got permission to refer the second step, put a package on the ballot that tries to make sense of these conflicting demands, and got the 2/3 of the House and the Senate it would take to send it to the ballot in 2009 or 10 or beyond. If that proposal reaches the ballot with just a parade of politicians behind it, with their paws out, it will fail, and deserve to. I think. This plan can't be cobbled together in some dark corner of the Capitol. It's got to enjoy broad support. You've got to tell us what you want, what you value, how you rank these priorities, how low you want to go to maintain a healthy set of services in the state, and how much you're willing to pay for it. I don't think there's any shortcut around that honest conversation, nor do I think there's any substitute for an informed electorate. I think this meeting is good proof that there's plenty of well-meaning folks, I suspect from both parties, who are interested in solving these problems. You're spending, I hate to tell you, a beautiful day talking about the future of this state. I think this is one of the most important conversations taking place in any conference room in Colorado right now, but we need more folks like you to do the same. Yeah?
You said and listen to our local issues and all of those topics, and when you acknowledge that the state is holding that sort of fiscal paying for those services.
Yes?
How much more information do you think we could be at the state level if we were to do that?
That's a great point. I think that would help. The question was, could we be more, how much more influential could you be if you worked regionally? Yeah, I think you can, and you do. I mean, Club 20, Action 22, Progressive 15, there are obviously networks of counties that pool their power to exert influence on the capital. And you obviously have a